Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long interview program where we invite a guest host to interview the author of a new book. This week, Mia Bay, associate history professor at Rutgers University, recounts the life of 19th century suffragist and civil rights activist Ida B. Wells in her book, To Tell the Truth Freely. Ms. Bay recalls Ida B. Wells' appeal to the Supreme Court after being removed from a seat on a train because of her race, her assistance in founding the NAACP in 1910, and her international campaign against lynching. Mia Bay discusses her book with Elsa Barkley Brown, Associate History and Women's Studies Professor at the University of Maryland.
I'm Elsa Barkley Brown, and I'm here with Mia Bay to talk about her new book, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells. Welcome. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Why don't we begin with your just outlining who Ida B. Wells is and why you wanted to write a biography of her.
Ida B. Wells was an anti-lynching crusader who first rose to fame in the 1890s. She was born during the Civil War. She was the child of slaves. They were all freed at the end of the war, and by the 1890s she was the most famous black woman in America, and what she was famous for was this very outspoken crusade against lynching, this form of racial violence that was kind of at an all-time height in the South during the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Okay. Well, why don't we start by sort of just walking through her life a little bit,
Okay.
letting people know about that, and then definitely want to hear about like how she could be the most famous black woman. In the book you talk about slavery as important to her early political understandings, but she's a young child in slavery. So why don't you tell us about her family and their experiences in slavery and how that sort of shapes her?
One of the things I was very much struck by when I was researching her life and reading her own autobiographical writings was that she talked about slavery and Reconstruction like it was just yesterday. And so I started thinking about that, why that was, and looking into why that was. And I think it was, above all, that she was the child of ex-slave parents. She watched her father go off to political meetings during the Reconstruction era, an era in which the black men who met and voted and had their own sort of Republican parties, things were often shot at. So her mother would be at home very worried when her father was participating in politics. And she was aware of, you know, the kind of commitment and excitement her parents felt to black civil rights, to full participation in American society, even though it was so difficult. And I think that's one reason why that in her later life, she saw black civil rights erode, she saw African Americans lose the vote in the South, and she always understood how important it was, and she grew up to be very activist. And in fact, during her, I think there were a couple of things that happened to her personally when she was a young woman that got her on the road towards anti-lynching. One was that after her parents died when she was 16. They both died in this yellow fever epidemic that swept the Mississippi Valley in 1878.
Where was she born? Where did she
Holly
actually grow up?
Springs, Mississippi.
Mississippi.
And she ended up taking care of her siblings. She had 5 siblings. She had had 6, but one also died in the yellow fever epidemic. And almost from the beginning, she's 16 years old, she's taking care of her siblings, and people begin to talk about her as, you know, a loose woman because she's living by herself with those children. And she's very shocked by this, and she begins to realize that there's, you know, that the atmosphere in her little town in the South generally is very sort of sexually charged. Black women are very likely to be, become sort of suspect if they do anything that's considered immoral, and that is partially a legacy of slavery. So she's, on that level, it made her realize that people could be very subject to unjust accusations. And then not very many years later, she was making her living as a teacher, and she traveled back and forth to work by the train. and she got kicked off a train for riding in the ladies' car, as the first class car was then known. This was a time before the kind of full segregation of colored cars and white cars had really taken shape, and instead there was this older system of gender segregation. And of course, it was, I mean, legally it was not clear that Wells couldn't sit in a ladies' car, so she fought back, she sued, she ultimately lost, but I think she began to understand quite vividly at that point that politics and civil rights were very important to women as well as men, and that was when she first started writing articles for a newspaper.
Okay. So what kind of education had she had for this? You said she becomes a teacher.
She had had a limited education. She went to school along with her mother, all the kids do, right after slavery.
And she and her mother were in classes together?
Yes, her mother her mother in 1865, when she was freed, went to school with her children because she wanted to learn how to read the Bible. She stayed until she could read the Bible. And all the children continued on. So Wells had had education up to age 16, but obviously she didn't complete her education. Once her parents died, she dropped out of school and began teaching elementary school herself. And that was sort of, after that, all of her education was her, she did it herself. She would teach school during the day, and then she would sit and read at night.
But you write about her time as a teacher, and eventually that becomes not so satisfactory a profession for her. What kind of experiences did she have, or what were the reasons why that didn't turn out to be what she really wanted to do with her life?
Well, I think it was terrifyingly difficult in the beginning. She taught at country schools because she didn't qualify to teach at any kind of higher level, and she taught mostly ex-slaves and their parents, and she was, as she later remembered, a green girl in her teens. And she saw these people who needed all sorts of education. I mean, not just the children, but also their parents. They needed to learn about life. They needed to learn about, living in a free society. And she felt, in the beginning, she just felt inadequate. And, but she also, felt all their educational needs. And over time, she would begin to feel like more able to meet them, but she would never feel that teaching was the way to do it. One thing would be her lack of education. She would never qualify to teach beyond elementary grades, so she was sort of stuck in that. And then she also didn't necessarily feel that that was her talent. Once she began to write, she felt much more comfortable doing that.
But in her writing, in her early writing, she also had a sort of critique of the schools, right, as well.
That's true. The politics of the schools, teaching in the schools involved a bureaucracy, the school board, a lot of petty stuff. I guess she felt like it wasn't ideally designed to really educate people.
So she seems to gravitate toward journalism, and that seems to really be her passion. How does she come to first begin to write for papers, and who's supporting her? What kinds of things is she writing?
After she gets kicked off the railroad and she launches this suit against the railroad, she writes up an account of her experience, and she publishes it in the local Baptist newspaper called The Living Way. And after that, she continues to write things, and first in The Living Way, and her stuff gets picked up and it appears in other newspapers. So eventually she starts to sell writings to a variety of newspapers, black newspapers across the country. And eventually she actually begins to move out of teaching and into the news business.
And so what were these early writings about?
Oh, good question. The early writings were about a lot of things. The interesting thing is she didn't stick to the sort of subject of that a lot of women journalists of the time stuck to, sewing, clothing, and so forth. She wrote about an ideal girl and how girls should comport themselves, but she also wrote about racial discrimination, local politics, basically anything she took her mind to, she would write about.